Okay, we don't have time for questions, so we'll move on and we'll pick those up in the discussion at the end of this time. Okay, our next speaker is Tom Coleman, and Tom's with the USDA Forest Service just over here in San Bernardino. And Tom's going to be talking to us this morning about what the USDA Forest Service potential response could be if this beetle problem with the fungus ends up in some of our wilderness areas.
Thanks, Mark. Thanks for having me out. What our response could be, we've already started working on this a little bit, I'll say, just kind of hearing a talk earlier in the year. I really wouldn't be a good entomologist in forest health protection if I didn't listen to my Washington representation. So if you remember Bob Biles standing up here saying, where is it, what is it doing, and how do we manage it? That's typically kind of my response to our invasion. We are really starting out with detection. Most of this has been ground surveys early on, really trying to map out what some of these susceptible hosts are and where they are on the landscape of the national forest. We also do yearly aerial surveys. This kind of points us in the right direction if we start seeing any major tree mortality. And then we'll probably start doing some trapping here just before it starts getting a little bit colder. Also education, really just pushing this information out to the foresters and the natural resource people I work with on the national forest. And then ultimately working close with either UCR or PSW with Forest Service research to kind of fill in the knowledge gaps. As Keith showed and where we all went, the infestation is very close to the national forest. It's only about 5 kilometers. It's probably less than that from what Keith's found in some of these areas, 7 kilometers from Huntington Gardens. This is a very general map of kind of what Keith showed. The big red blob is kind of where he's found it, just to show you where I've gone out on the national forest and really started to look for the shot hole borer. I also had our group in Forest Health Monitoring just produce maps of some of these susceptible species. So a lot of those hosts that they had on that new sheet was in our packet. I could care less about castor bean or silk tree or whatever it's hitting, but coast live oak, white alder, if you squint really hard, maple, sycamore, and willow. So there's not a very large component of these hardwoods out on the national forest, but certainly coast live oak and white alder is one that's more prominent in a lot of these riparian areas. This is one of the areas I went out and looked at. This is Millard Canyon Trailhead. It's just kind of on the western side of the Angeles National Forest. Nice little area. It's mostly a trailhead and some recreation residences. This is Eaton County Park. This is county land, but it does butt up right against national forest. Mostly coast live oak and California sycamore. This is Chantry Flats picnic area. As I mentioned the other day, these are wonderful areas to work in, sheer cliffs almost. You're looking out over kind of Glendora, Azusa area. But it gives you an idea, and Tom had some really nice pictures too about showing this kind of lower elevation landscape on a national forest. It's mostly chaparral species, and so if you're looking at the hardwoods, you're in these kind of draws, you're right next to the water. This is Mount Baldy Canyon. It's another very kind of well-visited recreation area. People like to get out from the Inland Empire up into the water a little bit. So that's kind of where it initially started, and we've seen a lot of these injury symptoms so far, but really just kind of what I went out and looked for. Keith has a really kind of nice little rating system as far as crown injury or boring dust entry holes. Also this cankering, gumming, any of these sugars, but really any recent tree mortality. Initial goal is to go out and set up baseline data to kind of start from and see how, again, what is it going to be doing in these stands if it is going to cause an impact. Some of the common hardwood species that are out there, so California sycamore, white alder, this is coast live oak, California bay laurel, big leaf maple, and willow. That's some of the more prominent ones that are found, certainly on the Angeles. You lose a little when you start moving to San Bernardino National Forest, some of the same on the Cleveland National Forest, a little bit further south of this area. From my initial surveys, I have not found T-shot borer. That's, I guess, pretty good. I'm not saying it's not there. We still have to get out and do a lot more surveys and do a lot more trapping, but it wasn't very obvious, like when you walked into Huntington or LA Arboretum, you could find it. These are the more prominent species: big leaf maple, white alder, coast live oak, California sycamore. All those are on that little sheet. it's susceptible to canker of the beetle. Pretty good sizes. Most of the larger stuff is coast live oak and California sycamore, but I mean, there's a lot of really small diameter trees in this area as well. Just to give you an idea of what I am seeing out in these areas, we have seen defoliation on white alder from alder flea beetle. This has been occurring for about the past 3 years. Doesn't really do much, turns heads for some of the resource officers, but then it refoliates and doesn't really cause much of a problem. I did find a little bit of cankering on white alder in a couple of areas, Miller Flats and up on Mount Baldy. It wasn't really associated with any insect or ambrosial beetle damage. I know they were looking for some Phytophthora back in the day with my pathologist and some UCR work, but wasn't really causing any major, any dieback or anything like that. As far as insect injury, this is about the only thing I really found. This is on willow. It's most likely maybe an Agrailus pileatus or Agrailus fulminans. Just a little wood borer activity, again, wasn't really causing much of any problem whatsoever. I would say I rarely look at willows, but it was kind of impressive to see that. And as far as tree mortality in these areas, a little bit of big leaf maple, a little bit of white alder, but really nothing really to speak of. I mean, most of these I think can be attributed to just changes in the riparian area, and some were getting a little bit more water, a little bit less water, but no significant injury evidence found. Certainly no really evidence associated with T-shot borer or some of these other ambrosia beetles. As far as our aerial survey data, we did just fly in the 1st of August. We fly all of Southern California. We tend to stay very close to the national forest. You can kind of see our flight path here. So here's the Angeles, kind of here's where the infestation is. Only really hardwood mortality mapped was oaks. Most of that was all down in Cleveland National Forest. The only other thing we did pick up was a little bit of alder defoliation again, and that's pretty evident from the air. But we will get out again and kind of ground check a lot of these that are in the lower elevations to see what's going on. But nothing really jumping out at us so far. And here's the Cleveland. I'll talk about this a little bit more. This is the Trabuco Ranger District, so if there is any infestation in Orange County, that's kind of the next areas we'll be getting out and looking. So here's that. Just to continue mostly on Angeles National Forest, if we eventually get the time, we'll jump over to San Bernardino, but I am going to really focus on Trabuco. And if you love really wonderful lush forests, don't go to the Trabuco Ranger District. This is again very steep, very tight canyons, mostly chaparral. You're just going to get a little bit of sycamore and coast live oak, a little bit of walnut. But it does butt up right against the urban area, so we'll get out and kind of look at that. So as far as our activities in 2013 and even later this year, again, just to establish that baseline data. These stands are not very easy, and I use stands loosely to survey just because it is so scattered. And it's a big leaf maple here, and then you crawl down 50 feet in the drainage and you pick up maybe one oak, and then you move on a little bit further. But we will expand that. So again, Angeles, Cleveland is kind of my first preference. If we do start finding the beetle, then we'll really kind of start doing more intensive surveys and following this year after year. I do want to run traps. We've done some other trapping work with Hylargus lignipara. Basically, we just ran transects from the urban areas, looking to see it moving into the national forest landscape. So kind of do that same thing throughout Southern California. And I've talked with the Keefe about really expanding that. So doing our transects on national forest and also the urban areas. If we find anything, pass the samples to a Keefe. Again, this education, I can't say that there's probably been too much awareness on the national forest side. They see a little bit of these emails of the meetings going out, but not much. And again, this collaboration with UCR, so with the Keefe, I've talked a little bit with Richard about expanding some of this trapping work. But typically, you're not going to find me out on private land. I may look a little bit at state lands or some other concerns if Tom Smith or Kim Camilli with CAL FIRE can't make it down here, but I'm going to hang close to this little green boundary right there. So as far as the National Forest response, you're probably not going to see much from them unless it's really in some of these high-value sites. And until the research and everything comes up to date, You're only going to get work really in these trailheads, administration sites, and campgrounds. They're not going to get into these riparian areas. The only reason the National Forest may be concerned, there's a big push with watershed management these days, and that's what they're going to focus on, and then maybe some loss of wildlife habitat.
Okay, thank you.